Aloha and welcome back to the garden. I'm Miss Amber and I'm really excited for you to be joining me today. If you were with us last class, you might remember talking about soil and all the different kinds of soil that there are. And today we're going to be looking at a way that we can help make our soil really healthy. We're going to be talking and learning about composting. So what is composting? Well, it's a way that people like you and me can make really rich, healthy soil by recycling or reusing our food scraps and our yard waste. So I want you to think about your favorite fruit or vegetable. Can you picture it in your head? And I want you to imagine eating that fruit or vegetable. Is there any part of it that you don't eat? For example, I love apples, but when I eat an apple, I don't eat the seeds or the core or the stem. I love oranges, but after I eat an orange, what's left over? The peel, right? Those are the parts that I don't eat. Those are my food scraps. So these food scraps, instead of throwing them in a trash can to go to a landfill, we can actually recycle them and turn them into compost soil. To learn how this works, let's look at how nature does it, because we can learn a lot from nature. So I want you to picture a forest full of trees. And in that forest, when a leaf falls from a tree, what happens to the leaf? Well, first, it lands on the ground where there's probably a lot of other fallen leaves. And then over a long time, it starts to dry out and starts to crumble into little pieces. And maybe some critters come along, some little insects and bugs, and they start eating that leaf and break it down into even smaller pieces. And it keeps breaking down into smaller and smaller pieces until it breaks down into its smallest form and becomes part of the soil. This same process of breaking things down eventually happens to everything that came from a living thing. Nothing in nature is ever wasted. It's all broken down and reused and turned into something new, like soil. Now we can copy nature and turn our food waste into soil too, and this is called composting. Now what can we compost? Well, anything that is a plant or is made from a plant can be composted. So if it grew out of the ground, it can go back in the ground. So how do we turn this leftover food and these plants into compost? Well, to do this, we are going to become soil chefs. So I want you to go ahead, put your chef hat on, go into your soil kitchen and prepare to make a nice compost stew. There are 4 ingredients that we need for our compost stew. Those are greens, browns, water, and air. So our greens can be many different things, but they are always plant material, like our fruit and vegetable scraps that we were talking about earlier. But our greens can be more than just fruits and vegetables. There are lots of other foods that are made out of plants too. For example, breads and pastas are made out of grains, and grains come from a plant. And tea bags and coffee grounds, those come from plants too. Can you think of other foods that you might eat that come from plants? Now, not everything we eat comes from a plant, right? So not all of our food scraps can be composted. Any foods that come from an animal, like meat or dairy products like milk and yogurt and cheese and eggs, those things shouldn't go in our compost because it can make it really smelly and it can attract animals like rats and mice that we don't want in our compost. The one exception to this is eggshells. Eggshells are actually really good for our compost. Okay, so we know that our greens are plant material, or plant-based food, right? So what are our browns? Our browns are any plant material that's dead and dried out, like dried out leaves, twigs, sticks, dried grass, and even paper products, because what is paper made out of? trees. And trees are a plant that grows out of the ground. So anything made of paper and made of trees can go back into the ground. Things like paper bags and paper towels, newspapers, all of those things are compostable. All right, so let's go back to our soil kitchen. In our big compost stew pot, we have our first two ingredients, our greens and our browns. And when we mix these together in a nice balanced way, not too much of one, not too much of the other, then we need some help breaking things down in there. And this is where the compost FBI comes in to help. The F stands for fungus. Fungus are things like mushrooms and mold. The B stands for bacteria, and bacteria are microscopic organisms, which means they're so small you can only see them with a microscope. And I is for invertebrates. Invertebrates are things like insects, worms, beetles, centipedes, and all of those kinds of critters. The FBI are responsible for breaking down all of our greens and browns into tiny, tiny pieces. And this is where our second two compost stew ingredients come in, water and air. Like all living things, the fungus, bacteria, and invertebrates in our soil need water and air to survive. And so by keeping our compost nice and moist and by mixing it every once in a while to give it fresh air, we're giving those FBI everything they need to help break down our compost. So when we combine all of these things, our food scraps, our grass trimmings, our dried leaves and paper products, and some water and air, and we mix it all together, we turn this waste into usable compost soil. And then we can use this compost soil to grow new fruits and veggies for us to eat. And when we eat those and we have our food scraps left over, what can we do with those? We can compost them back into soil and grow new fruits and veggies again. What a cool cycle to be part of. So let's see what this actually looks like, and let's build a small compost system in a jar together. In this activity, we're going to add all of our compost ingredients together in a jar and see what happens. Let's take a look at our ingredients. Here we have coffee grounds, an apple core, and some old flowers. Are these ingredients greens or browns? In this container, we have some vegetable peels like cucumbers and carrots. Are these greens or browns? Here we have some dry leaves and dry grass. Are these greens or browns? We also have some fresh grass cuttings and some green leaves. Are these ones greens or browns? And lastly, we have some paper. Is this considered a green or a brown? Great job! And now we have some water that we'll add at the very end to keep our compost nice and moist. So we're going to start by adding a little bit of soil into our jar first, and this is going to help introduce some of those FBI critters quickly into our compost. And now we'll begin layering all of our greens and browns a little bit at a time, one on top of the other, and you can use any greens and browns in small layers. I'm going to add this apple core towards the edge so we can see what happens to it over time. You'll notice that I'm tearing everything into really small little pieces, and this makes it easier to break down for the FBI. Imagine you're eating a pizza. It's really hard to just eat a whole pizza all in one piece, but when you cut it up into smaller pieces, it makes it a lot easier to eat it. Same idea for the FBI. Once our jar starts to fill up, we'll end with a nice layer of browns, and then it's time to add a little bit of water to keep our compost soil nice and moist. So our very last step is to add the lid. And because we want airflow, I'm actually going to make a paper lid for my jar so I can poke holes in it. If you're using a plastic container, you can poke holes in that lid too. But you want to make sure there's plenty of airflow. And now that we've added our greens and browns and water and air, our compost jar is finished, and we'll set it out in the sun and see what happens. Mahalo for joining me in the garden today, and aloha.